The pandemic pushes Australia into the recession it couldn't avoid.
What we were facing was an economist's version of Armageddon.
Sheep meant for the virus-hit Al Kuwait to be slaughtered here, causing fears of a price drop. Thousands defy the curfew, but violence has eased and demonstrations are mostly peaceful. And Fremantle's Cam McCarthy taken to hospital after collapsing at training. Good evening, Pamela Medlen with ABC News. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Australia is entering a recession, ending a run of economic growth that began in the Hawke-Keating era. New figures have confirmed the economy went backwards in the March quarter, a direct result of the bushfire and COVID-19 crises. But with hundreds of thousands of Australians still out of work, the Federal Treasurer's warned the worst is yet to come. Political editor Andrew Probyn begins our coverage.
29 years after the recession we had to have comes the one we couldn't avoid.
Is Australia in recession today?
The answer to that is yes.
Josh Frydenberg didn't utter the R word, instead painting the grimmest of pictures.
This was the economist's version of Armageddon.
In the first 3 months of the year, Australia's economy shrank by 0.3%, the first negative quarter since 2011. The year-on-year result, the weakest since the global financial crisis. The March quarter had it all.
Flood, fire, drought, and now the coronavirus pandemic.
The education and tourism sectors were struck first by COVID-19 when arrivals from China were banned in February. Tougher distancing restrictions in March forced the closure of pubs, cafes, restaurants and some shops. Panic buying at supermarkets didn't stop household spending plummeting.
Massive drop. Transport, hotels, cafes.
Australia's done well when you look overseas. Japan's contraction 3 times bigger. The United States economy down 1.3%, the UK 2%. Italy and France, which were also hit hard by COVID-19, both shrank by more than 5%, almost double that in China, where the virus first struck. But today's figures don't reflect the economic horror many are experiencing. The current quarter will be awful.
Far more severe than what we have seen today. But it's really a consumption story.
Treasury's expecting the economy to shrink 10% in the June quarter, bringing almost 3 decades of uninterrupted growth to a shocking stop.
This long run of growth was created by Hawke and Keating, it was defended by Rudd and Swan, and it ends under Morrison and Frydenberg.
Many Australians already know the brutal reality of this recession, and with unemployment to remain painfully high for quite some time, creating jobs will remain a challenge long after the pandemic has passed. To that end, employers and unions today held the first of several meetings to see if they can agree on how workplace laws can be changed to make that easier.
We all have to come into this process and be willing to make compromises.
We're going to approach it with an open mind. We're going to approach it in good faith.
A new era of consensus? Too early to tell. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
It was the slump in spending which really hit the economy hard. And saving rates also increased, even as millions of people turned to government support. Here's finance correspondent Philip Lasker.
Kylie Gemmell and her partner Trent Glass were living their dream in regional New South Wales. But that turned into a nightmare when their accommodation business was hit by the drought, then bushfires and now the lockdown.
The tap was literally just turned off.
This year's income is zero.
As a business, it's definitely very worrying, and to be quite honest, I don't think that any business could have planned for the succession of disasters that we've had.
The economy was already pretty weak coming into 2020.
From mid-March, the pandemic and lockdowns pushed the economy off a cliff. Spending on services like travel, accommodation and hospitality plunged, while people panic-bought food and groceries. The savings rate rose sharply. Australians were scared or simply unable to spend as the economy shut down. Business and housing investment was subdued, highlighting concerns about construction jobs. Supporting the economy was government spending, triggered by the support payments needed following the natural disasters and lockdown. Trade was also a positive because our exports proved more resilient than imports, which fell sharply because the economy was so weak. These numbers are just the tip of the iceberg. 600,000 people have been thrown out of work and a large part of the private sector is on its knees. It means government support will need to remain in place for some time to come.
Elevated debt levels, low productivity, weak wages, all of that's still there when we come out.
Kylie Gemmell is hoping the worst is over as restrictions are eased.
People were just desperate to get away. I think everyone was sick of being in lockdown, and our bookings have been strong.
What could possibly go wrong? Philip Lasker, ABC News.
Thousands of protesters have again taken to the streets across America, defying curfews for an eighth night. But the demonstrations are now largely peaceful, even as the anger over the death of George Floyd continues. After President Donald Trump threatened to bring in the military, the Pentagon has moved about 1,600 troops to be on standby outside Washington. From there, North America correspondent David Lipson begins our coverage.
In America's capital, they marched on the Lincoln Memorial and were met by the National Guard. In Portland, thousands lay face down on a bridge to remember today's icon of black justice, George Floyd. All over America, countless thousands made their voices heard peacefully.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Even cowboys in Texas turned out for the cause.
I'm here today so she doesn't have to come back in 15 years for the same issue and protest again. So we want it fixed now.
Keep going. Keep going.
For those in charge, the first priority is restoring law and order. A looting free-for-all in New York last night drew harsh words from the governor.
The NYPD and the mayor did not do their job last night.
Welcome to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. You're not burning down our city.
While in Idaho, locals were taking security into their own hands. The self-proclaimed law and order president stood for the cameras before a papal statue, but the presidential motorcade was booed as it returned to the White House. The clearing out of peaceful protesters for yesterday's photo opportunity has caused widespread outrage. Even ardent supporters of the president had blunt advice.
Seems like now is the time to say, I understand your pain. I want to comfort you. I think it's time we love each other. But the president took a different course.
Others saw it as a show of strength in a time of need.
It was strong and powerful for the president to go there and say, we will not be cowed.
The protest movement is getting political.
I promise you this, I won't traffic in fear and division. I won't fan the flames of hate.
Well, it may not look like it from what you can see here and at other protests around the country, but Donald Trump still enjoys a lot of support, particularly in the states that matter.
Black Lives Matter!
Even here, there are doubts about his opponent.
Would like to see him out of the White House, of course. But then again, I don't know who else is going to be going in the White House next. Could be somebody worse than Donald Trump.
As night drew on, there were more clashes at the White House and arrests in New York. The rage hasn't burned out just yet. David Lipson, ABC News, Washington.
Protesters have again gathered in Minneapolis, where the mother of George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter told the crowd he was a good man who would never see his child grow up. The state's governor has announced a human rights investigation into the entire Minneapolis Police Department. Chief Foreign Correspondent Philip Williams reports.
Gianna Floyd, just 6 years old, her father taken from her under the weight of a police knee.
This is what those officers took from me.
Gianna's mother, Roxy Washington, was mourning a future lost for a child and her father.
He would never see her grow up, graduate. He would never walk her down the aisle.
Her dad gone, his memory, his name, now etched in American history.
George Floyd! George Floyd!
Across the nation, countless thousands heeded the family's call for peaceful protests.
The families asked everybody to take a breath, just to take a breath for peace, take a breath for justice.
The Minnesota Human Rights Department has launched a civil rights investigation into Minneapolis police.
We're going to establish peace on our streets when we address the systemic issues that caused it in the first place.
The state's governor is resisting calls from the president to send in even more National Guard troops. And from the Minnesota National Guard itself, a promise to heed the call from protesters to keep it low-key.
We heard it, and we're going to stay back behind, invisible, so that you can't see us. Is that okay? Yeah. Thank you.
That sense of cooperation between the protesters and the authorities has been seen in a number of cities.
Thank you.
But lurking amongst the thousands mobilising around the country is an unseen enemy. The risk of COVID-19 silently spreading through the crowds is frighteningly real.
I worry terribly about the peaceful protests. I see some wearing masks. I see some others not wearing masks.
One man's brutal death, one way or another, could cost many more lives in the weeks ahead. Philip Williams, ABC News.
The live export of tens of thousands of West Australian sheep to the Middle East has been blocked because of heat stress concerns during the northern summer. The $12 million shipment was delayed by a coronavirus outbreak on the Al Kuwait livestock carrier, which was meant to transport the animals. But the federal regulator refused to grant an exemption to allow the sheep to be exported, and the industry warns the decision could have costly consequences.
It's a decision that has incensed the live export industry.
We are gobsmacked, and it was a gutless thing they did. There's no shadow of doubt.
I thought we had some pretty solid arguments in our application. We were very disappointed, and we still believe it's the wrong decision.
These 56,000 sheep have been stranded at a feedlot south of Perth since a coronavirus outbreak among the crew of the Al Kuwait. The ship was meant to load and leave before the June 1 deadline imposed by the federal government for animal welfare reasons. The exporter applied for an exemption, but the federal independent regulator rejected it.
What we were actually looking for was some flexibility given the extraordinary circumstances that were at play.
Animal welfare advocates insist the right decision was made, saying the voyage could not have been undertaken safely.
The hottest and most dangerous months of the year for sheep exports into the Middle East. The temperatures far exceed the animals' heat stress thresholds.
While some people will be a bit grumpy about this, I'm sure that in the long run it is ensuring that we don't have another disaster.
The sheep are expected to be processed locally, which the industry expects will drive down prices. But the sector is also concerned there'll be a lasting impact from damaged trading relationships, with fears it'll affect efforts to use Kuwait as a market for Australian barley, following tariffs imposed by China.
The Chinese market was a big part of our barley market. They've walked away from us. Plan B was the Gulf, and now we've gone and slapped them in the face. They are very, very angry about what we've done.
But the state government insists those fears are unfounded.
This has not been a problem of Australia's making. We have tried to deal with this.
With most crew members in hotel quarantine, the Al Kuwait has had a deep clean, but can't leave for at least another 10 days. Jacob Kagi, ABC News.
Upgrading of the emergency department at the Peel Health campus will begin later this month. The $5 million project includes improvements to the triage area and waiting room. It was supposed to begin in early March but was postponed because of the pandemic. To the numbers, and there was one new active case overnight, a man in his 30s who'd recently returned from overseas. There are 26 active cases and the state's total is 592. Opposition leader Lisa Harvey is sticking to her guns on WA's interstate border, defending her calls for the state to reopen to the rest of Australia. Ms Harvey has been adamant the interstate border should be opened, despite indications the WA public backs its closure. It's understood her call has upset some Liberal colleagues who fear that position is unpopular. But Ms Harvey says she won't be backing down.
The Liberal Party has always stood for small business and for medium businesses, and every day a family business goes to the wall is an absolute tragedy for every person who calls themselves a Liberal.
The government says the border won't be reopened until community transmission of coronavirus has stopped in all other states. To finance now, and the market shrugged off the news that Australia is in recession with strong gains by both shares and the dollar. Here's Alan Kohler.
Well, the markets have known for months that Australia would have a recession this year, so no surprise there. Today's action was a continuation of the view that the recovery will look like a V, which is what the Australian dollar chart looks like. The trade-weighted index is all the way back to where it was in January, which is 69.5 US cents and 62 euro cents. In fact, at one stage today, the exchange rate was nudging 70 US cents. Now, there are two specific reasons the dollar is rising. The iron ore price is up more than 20% in a month, and the US dollar is falling. More broadly, it's about optimism, which means all risk assets are booming, and that includes shares as well as the Aussie dollar, because global investors reckon it's all going to be okay. The All Ordinaries Index went above 6,000 today, led mainly by the banks and beaten up stocks like Qantas. The buy now, pay later firm Zipco went up another 22%, making it 67% in 2 days after it bought an American rival. And a little company named FBR, which stands for Fast Brick Robotics, went up 32% today after reporting that its bricklaying robot is now laying 200 bricks an hour, which is about twice what your average human bricklayer can do, apparently. Global markets were all higher last night and today. The iron ore price reversed 1% last night, while oil jumped 3.7%. And finally, here's a graph of per capita GDP, which removes the effect of population growth. It fell 0.7% in the March quarter, more than twice the fall in total GDP, and it's been in trend decline for decades. And that's finance.
2 men have been given prison sentences for corrupt dealings with a high-ranking WA health bureaucrat. Philip Wood had pleaded guilty to more than a dozen charges, including fraud and corruption. His company, Fox United, had submitted inflated invoices to the North Metropolitan Health Service. The court heard half of the extra money was used for renovations for then senior health bureaucrat John Fullerton. The benefit to Wood was in the tens of thousands of dollars. While he's repaid the money, he was sentenced to more than 2 years. Anthony Williams pleaded guilty to 7 charges of corruption. His company, Westside, paid for overseas trips, accommodation and AFL tickets for Mr Fullerton over about a decade. Williams was sentenced to 19 months prison and is eligible for parole. Still to come this hour, how the recession is forcing people to move back in with their parents.
The business that I own stopped 100%, so no income, which is difficult.
It's evolved our relationship from being one where it's sort of parent and child to being on the same level.
The noise factor, the privacy factor, how does all that work? And every family will be different.
Plus, meet the Australians caught in America's protests. That's coming up.
Australian universities are stepping up their campaign for a taxpayer bailout, releasing their own modelling that indicates they face a $16 billion revenue hit by 2023. The unis say that will cripple research, which could spearhead the post-COVID economic recovery.
Professor Hala Zirakat is a leading biomedical engineer. The Harvard fellow manufactures bone and tissue when the body can't do the job itself.
We're bringing talents to Australia who eventually will stay in Australia, contribute to the progress of innovation and economy in Australia.
Research like this has been bankrolled by revenue from international students and helped Australian unis soar in global rankings. The pandemic has forced a change in direction.
Moving away from research because there isn't that job security.
The decade of record revenue from overseas students meant the major players entered the crisis with billion-dollar reserves. Now even the richest unis are bracing to make big cuts, warning economic growth will be a casualty.
Are we going to downsize it, de-skill Australians and not have emerging high-tech companies that power our economy?
ANU's chief, Brian Schmidt, is an astrophysicist awarded a Nobel Prize for discoveries about the universe. The next generation's horizons could be more limited.
Australia will just find itself a less wealthier place.
The universities with the weakest balance sheets, generally regional and suburban campuses, are negotiating with banks and fighting to keep jobs.
It's never a pleasant thing to ask your staff to take a reduction in their pay, and we don't do it lightly.
Central Queensland University and Geelong's Deakin University have already laid off staff, while Melbourne's La Trobe searches for answers.
We've instituted savings measures of about $80 million already this year.
Universities are desperate for extra cash, but the government is defending current funding levels. And there's a view the onus should be on vice-chancellors who often earn seven-figure salaries to fix their fragile business models. Connor Duffy, ABC News.
There's been a spike in coronavirus cases in Tokyo a week after it lifted a state of emergency. The city's governor issued an alert as the Japanese capital recorded 34 new cases in the past 24 hours. It's a marked increase from late May when infections had slowed to just a few per day. Around a third of the cases are linked to bars and nightclubs, making contact tracing harder. If infections continue to rise, residents could again be asked to avoid non-essential outings. Future of work analysts say coronavirus could be the disruption that helps Australia carve out a stronger economic future. Businesses are being urged to use this time to innovate and reduce their reliance on global supply chains for manufacturing.
This cleaning product manufacturer still lives by two lessons it learned during the Great Depression and World War II: support local supply chains and prioritise research and development.
Look at what you could do locally without reliance upon foreign product was really important.
It gave the business a head start in producing a coronavirus-killing hospital disinfectant, while its competitors were held up by a reliance on global supplies. A shortage of essential medical supplies during the pandemic has revealed the impact of a hollowed-out manufacturing sector.
Whilst it's great to have trade relationships and supply chains that are global, in some situations, there are things that we really need to have in Australia.
We have had a long history of, I guess, a fairly lazy economy around digging product out of the ground and shipping it overseas without adding value to it.
Coronavirus has given many businesses the chance to experiment in value-adding and developing niche products. The real test will be if local collaborations are prioritised and expanded to other industries such as energy once the crisis is over.
So the idea really that needs to be explored further is what products are actually needed, where are they needed, and how can we adapt and be agile.
Future of Work analysts say Australia is being held back from participating in the fourth industrial revolution by a skills mismatch. This could be alleviated if people who have lost their jobs use this time to upskill or retrain in growth industries such as transport and the care sector.
A lot of the skill sets going forward are going to be about resilience, digital technology, problem solving, remote working, different types of communication.
Turning a crisis into a clean slate. Angela Ross, ABC News.
In the AFL, the Fremantle Dockers say they don't know why forward Cam McCarthy collapsed during a non-contact training session this morning. McCarthy was taking part in a drill with teammates when he collapsed, but he was later able to walk to an ambulance to be taken to hospital. Coach Justin Longmuir says it's too early to know if the 25-year-old will travel to the Gold Coast next week.
Our mind is on Cam's health and well-being. We'll work out what it means for the hub and you know what that looks like going forward after we get the medical recommendations.
The Dockers fly to Queensland next Tuesday before their round 2 match against Brisbane next weekend. WA cricket captain Mitch Marsh says he's hopeful the domestic season will start at the beginning of summer. Players have returned to training but still don't know when the domestic One-Day Cup and Sheffield Shield seasons will begin. However, Marsh says he'll be ready when it does resume. Success in the Shield is a motivating factor.
We're certainly striving for it, yeah. As a captain and as a leader, you want to make sure that you want to win a Sheffield Shield, but I think every single person in this organisation is doing everything they possibly can to try and win a Shield.
WA hasn't won the competition since 1999. Former West Coast Eagles ruckman Dean Cox has been inducted into the AFL's Hall of Fame. Cox played 290 games for the Eagles, including the 2006 Premiership. He joins Brisbane Lions' Simon Black and Jonathan Brown, who were inducted last night. The duo played a crucial part in the Lions' famous three-peat from 2001 to 2003. Black won the Norm Smith Medal in the 2003 Grand Final win over Collingwood and says the performance is the most memorable of his career.
It's probably the most calm and relaxed and in tune with the game I've ever been. You talk about, I guess, being in the zone, and that's probably one of the most I've ever felt. Just the game came to me rather than having to feel like I had to push too hard.
Black and Brown joined their teammates Michael Voss, Jason Ackermanis and Nigel Lappin in the exclusive Hall of Fame club. Time now for the weather with Irina Saranik.
Good evening. We have a week of warm weather coming up in Perth. Today was about 6 degrees above average, reaching 25.1 at 3:15 in the afternoon. The low was 10.8 at 20 to 7 this morning. Right now we're sitting on 15 degrees. Further up the west coast, Geraldton climbed to 28, Morawa reached 25, but most other towns in the southern half got between 20 and 22 degrees. The lowest minimum this morning was 3 at Ayr in the southeast. The top temperature in the state was 32 degrees at Derby and Columbaroo in the Kimberley, as well as Mardi in the Pilbara. Broome, Port Hedland and Onslow were just behind, reaching 31. The satellite image shows some high and mid-level cloud streaming across the state from the west. There were falls of about 1 millimetre recorded in the central west overnight, but much of that cloud has cleared out today. Tomorrow, a weak trough will move over the southwest, bringing the chance of showers, but the rest of the state will be dry and quite warm as a high sends in easterly winds. In fact, much of the country is clear under high pressure at the moment, and that will make for a cool morning in the southeast tomorrow, dipping to -2 in Canberra, followed by a top of 13. A cool morning in Melbourne, Hobart and Adelaide too, all rising to the mid-teens under mostly sunny skies in the afternoon. Back to WA. Clear skies for most of the north tomorrow. Carnarvon will be hot for this time of year, a top of 30 there, 30 for Port Hedland and Broome too, 32 in Columbaroo. Mostly sunny across central parts. Like today, the central west will be the warmest, reaching the high 20s, mid-20s for the Wheatbelt and Goldfields. Showers are possible over coastal areas from around Augusta to Albany. There's also a slight chance of showers in the Great Southern. The rest of the south will be dry. It'll be another warm day for Perth, a top of 25 degrees after a low of 11. We'll have light northeasterly winds before south to southwesterlies arrive in the late afternoon. Winds on the local waters will be northeasterly at about 10 knots, becoming south to southwesterly in the early afternoon, then tending south to southeasterly up to 15 knots in the late afternoon. The swell will be up to 2 metres. The sun will rise at 10 minutes past 7, setting at 19 past 5. Temperatures are staying well above average for the next week or so, and there's no substantial rain on the forecast. We can expect a sunny 24 degrees on Friday, 25 again on Saturday. There's just a slight chance of showers Saturday evening or Sunday morning, a top of 22 on Sunday and Monday, 23 on Tuesday, then 24 on Wednesday. The nights are staying mild too, in the double digits for the rest of this week. That's all in the weather. Pamela.
Thanks, Irina. Western Australia's next generation of drug detection dogs and their handlers have graduated in Perth. The lovable little Labradors all started out looking cute and cuddly, but only some of them have made it through the selection to become hard-nosed sniffer dogs. They were observed at play and sleep, and pups with promise then went through 10 weeks of training. They'll now be deployed in WA prisons to search inmates and visitors, as well as incoming mail.
What we've seen, as in other states and territories when we close down visits, there's been an increase in trying to traffic via mail. So we've picked that up, and part of the work that you've seen the dogs do today is checking that mail.
The dogs usually retire from service after 8 years and typically remain with their handler as a pet. And that's ABC News for now. Thanks for your company. I'll be back tomorrow, but stay with us for 7:30 with Lee Sales.